Welcome to the first video interview from Artificiality. We're starting a new series of video interviews because we are interested in interviewing AI innovators and entrepreneurs and being able to see the product that they're working on. So expect to see more of these as we progress through talking to people that we find inspiring and interesting. Today, we're starting with someone we've known for several years, Rob May. Rob, we first met Rob when he was founder and CEO of Tala, a conversational AI company, and when Helen and I were running Intelligentsia. Today, he is running a company called Nova, which makes a product called Brandguard. We find Brandguard to be really fascinating as a response to the sort of creative advantages of generative AI. So generative AI is creative. It can produce all kinds of interesting content, and much of that is unpredictable. Now, what do you do with that if you're trying to make sure that the content you're creating, whether it's for a website or for a social media post, or whether it's for one office or you got offices around the world, what do you do to make sure that that generative AI content stays on brand? Well, that's what Brandguard is here for. We think it's a very interesting use case. We've already talked with some of our clients about using it, and we're excited to present Rob and his product to you today. So thanks for joining us, and thanks again to Rob for joining us as well. If you like what we do at Artificiality, you can find us now here on YouTube. You can find us on your podcast platforms for our long-form podcast interviews, and you can get all of our video, audio, and our written content on Substack. So check us out at artificiality.substack.com. If you subscribe there, you'll get a message from us once a week with all of that week's content. Thanks a lot, and look forward to hearing from you. Send us some feedback. Thanks. Rob, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to talk to you and hear more about your new company.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Maybe you can start off by telling us a bit of the story of how you got to where you are now with Nova Brandguard and what gave you the idea of starting this company.
Well, so this is my fourth company and my fourth tech startup. And I've been deep in the AI space for a while, and I'm always looking for ideas that are a little non-obvious, but seem obvious when you run through sort of a logical chain of what's going to happen in the world. And we started with this idea that we would create a lot of advertising assets. So that was the original idea behind Nova. Was you could, if you want to sell this red pen, I can create 5,000 hyper-targeted Google or Facebook ads about this red pen. So they're slightly different for every possible customer combination you could have. And the thing that kept coming up when we went out to sell that product to early customers was this idea that, well, Rob, that sounds great, but what's going to happen if is like I have to review all those, because what if some of them have what if ChatGPT or whatever you're using to generate these puts out slight words that violate our brand voice guidelines or our style guide or whatever. So about 7 or 8 months ago, we started saying, well, I wonder if we could teach a machine to understand brands and branding. It turns out you can, but it's a little bit of a reverse of a reverse problem than traditional machine vision. So in traditional machine vision, I want to identify something, say a logo for a company. So in my training set, I need various versions of that logo. I need it a little bit rotated. I need it partially obscured. I need it reversed or different colors. We have the opposite problem, which is generative AI is going to produce a bunch of assets for us, and we only want to approve them if they're perfect. The logo has to be used the way we specify it and nothing else. So all that stuff that's normally training data to recognize something is negative training data for us. So we sort of, you need different training methods and different ways to think about this. So once that started to happen, and we heard this from customers, that really became the product. So while Nova started, Brandguard started as a feature on the Nova product, and then Brandguard became the product because it's what everybody wanted if they're thinking about using generative AI at scale. So just to give you an example, we're talking to one of the top CPG brands in the world, and their use case is we want to create 100,000 very granular landing pages where each landing page will pull from multiple generative models. There'll be a model that determines, okay, for this customer and this channel that's going to see this page, here's the hero statement. Here's another model chooses the product descriptions. Another one tweaks the product pictures, right? The angles, the backgrounds, whatever. And the guy said, I don't know how we would quality check all these things. And so that's a perfect use case for Brandguard. And so as we expand across all the tools that you use, the idea is that this becomes a tool that brands can upload their brand assets to. We train a series of models that you can then deploy anywhere that you use generative AI, emails, landing pages, customer facing product guides, and other types of content to make sure that there's brand consistency and observability around all that at scale.
That's exciting because it definitely the challenge, and we've went through this. We've had a conversation with you about this, talking with one of our clients about it. That one of the challenges, there's this sort of huge opportunity to put out content, but you're never really sure what it's going to be. And if you're only channeling it through a human as the as the gatekeeper, that can work when there's a small amount of content. You're saying, gee, I really want to use generative AI to help me write a better press release or something like that, where you like there's only a small number of gates that actually have to get through. But when you're talking about 100,000 landing pages, that's beyond beyond the scope of the employee's time to handle.
Right. And there's an interesting, some of these tools, we're talking to some companies whose brands are really popular for usage amongst third parties or digital collaborations. And they struggle with this at human scale because somewhere things have to get routed back to somebody who says, yes, that's the right way to use the brand. So those have been some of our early customers.
That's great. Do you have something you can show us so we can get a sense?
Yeah, so I'm going to show you guys something that'll be in the product soon. How do I share my screen? Okay, I see it. Share screen.
There you go. Awesome.
Okay, can you see this Brooks Brothers with Brandguard use case video?
Sure can.
Okay, so what's going to happen here is we are creating what we call a multimodal version of Brandguard. And what that means is we have tied together a large language model similar to ChatGPT with an image network so that the two can talk to each other and understand each other. So what that means is instead of just giving you a score on an image that would come out of a generative tool as to, is this 92% on brand? Is this 87% on brand? We actually now give an explanation about why it is or isn't. So this is not in the product yet. This will be coming in the product in Q3. But what you can see here is we upload this image and the LLM writes about the image. So it does, analysis on it. And then the human here is typing in below, is this image appropriate for Brooks Brothers? It's not appropriate because it's women in lingerie. So now we do it for something like this. Now, this is actually an ensemble of models in addition to the LLM and the ImageNet. And so part of what we do is we check for, so we'll stop sharing that there. We check for, in addition to the sort of deep learning model that looks at like, does this look and feel like your brand and all that kind of stuff. We check for like, profanity, nudity, just do humans have 5 fingers and not 6, no 3 eyeballs? Those early models are off the shelf and some of those are publicly available, but they even have to be tweaked because you can see like in that example, Brooks Brothers and Victoria's Secret might have different standards around what's considered nudity or inappropriate in terms of how much skin they show, right? American Eagle might allow more than like a kid's clothing brand. So these all have to be trained on a per brand basis, really fine-tuned, not trained. This is, when you hear the term training, you think, weeks of training on, it's not like that, right? We trained a giant model on brand assets, and now this can be fine-tuned with 20 or 30 samples to pull out the features that are more appropriate to a specific brand. And so the vision that I see of the future is that every brand is going to have these LLMs and these image diffusion models are going to verticalize, and brands are going to have their own versions of them. That's where I think this can go.
So how does it, in your early customers, what kind of feedback have you had from customers about how it changes their jobs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it depends on the type of customer in terms of where that feedback comes from. Sometimes for certain types of customers, it makes their job faster and easier. If you are a person who's typically waiting on other people to approve something, so like if you're an agency and you're constantly waiting on the brand to approve something, having a score where the brand maybe says to you, look, anything that's above 95%, just consider it approved. We trust the workflow models. That speeds everything up. So people really like that because there's less waiting around on that stuff. We also see that in some digital merchandising use cases. So one of our early beta customers automates a bunch of supply chain for corporate gear. And, let's say you're working with, General Motors, and people want to make a General Motors t-shirt for their team, and it has some specific team and, maybe geo branding or whatever. A big reason those things get rejected is that those things still have to meet brand guidelines. Right. And so if you're the company that's making money and you care about your cash cycles and everything else and your speed, and you're like, I wish somebody would approve this. I keep emailing people and there's a big delay. You want that sped up. So having an automated model that can do that is useful. For small companies, this is a use case that we didn't expect. I thought this is a product that the top 10 or 20,000 brands in the world will care about and nobody else. But it actually turns out there's a lot of small companies that might be 30 or 40 people. Maybe they have 2 people in marketing and they use a lot of consultants and contractors. And those contractors might create blog posts, social media posts that include imagery or whatever. And a big problem then for the marketing team is going back to them and say, like, no, we don't use that word. We use this word. No, that image is not appropriate because it has a kid in the image, and we sell to, young adults who don't have kids yet, or various things like that. So they use it as a first pass. So the contractors submit, data to a Brandguard page. And what you saw in that video, how it does tells you what's wrong with it or whatever, we give that feedback to them. They can see why it failed. They can go back and take another pass at it. The human still ultimately reviews it, but the human reviews it after the machine has at least gotten it a lot closer to being on brand. We don't have a use case yet. The 100,000 landing pages that I told you about, we're talking to a few companies about that type of use case, and they're interested. We haven't rolled one of those out yet, but it'll be really interesting to see what happens, because I'm sure you guys have seen this in some of your work, that people have this weird dichotomy with AI where they know they need it and they want it and they believe it can make everything better, but they're reluctant to turn work over to the machines fully. And there's this tension there. And so you really need to find ways to build trust and bridge that gap. And it's hard because we're turning work over to these machines that is more creative and fluid and probabilistic and not like the work that we've done in the past. So it's, yeah.
What do you get as a reaction to introducing AI into this kind of a topic area? I mean, there's definitely part of brand where some people will say, well, brand is kind of magic. Assembling the right words is just kind of a magical thing. Knowing whether those words are on brand or not is kind of an inherent human sort of moment of creativity and inspiration. And we've seen work through some of this in workshops with companies, and you see the output that comes out of it. And one of the common answers is it's close, but it's just kind of not there, or it's just a little bit flat. And I'm kind of curious what the reaction has been from people to say, what gets them over the hump that says, oh, actually, I can see how AI can really play a role in this thing that we might have previously thought is uniquely human.
Yeah, your comment that it's not quite there and doesn't get over the hump is really interesting, because I think what people miss, particularly about the LLMs, the large language models, is that they're trained on a bunch of web content, which kind of by definition is very average and homogenized, right? So when you do use these tools, you are much more likely to get something very average out of them and not something special, unless you do a lot of work to really craft a prompt that leads to something special. So the way that we normally approach it, based on the feedback that we hear, there's a couple of key things that we do. Number one, we let the user set the threshold. So what we ultimately are is a scoring system and a filtering system. And we let the user decide, do they want to see everything that's, between at least 80%, but not 95%? Or, do you want to auto approve things above a level and auto reject things above a level? Or you can set a broader level or a narrower level or whatever. So there's always a human in the loop because there are always gray areas, and even humans make mistakes, right? We can show you examples of brands that did things that people went, no, how did that get out, right? Yeah. There are always a couple of those stories out there. So that's one thing we do is we still provide some level of human control that's configurable. The second thing is we don't target what I would call your like core creative use cases. And this came from, we talked to one of the world's top agencies and they said, look, we work with one of the world's largest makeup brands, and we spend 4 or 5 months crafting like what are the 8 core images they're going to use in their advertising campaigns next year as the basis of that. And we don't intend to turn that over to generative AI anytime soon. So we don't go after use cases like that. We go after the derivative use cases where they say, well, what we would like to do is taking those 8 images and tweaking them in various ways for different demographics or different campaigns or different geos is a lot of work. And so there's a lot of campaigns we'd like to do, but we're too slow and it would cost too much money for the use case. But if you can lower the cost to take those assets and create them for smaller campaigns or campaigns that require more rapid response because they may be tied to minor holidays or newsworthy events or things that are going on. You can imagine, right? You're going through, the NBA finals and you didn't expect the Miami Heat to make it so far. And now that they do, you want to run a campaign with, around the Miami Heat in the finals because you're in Florida. It's like, well, can you put something together in a matter of days? Because if you can't, then you're not going to be able to execute on that campaign. But now with tools, with these generative tools, you can use your core imagery as the seed and you can build campaigns around that. And then you can do it at scale and you can do it fast and you can have an automated sort of filtering and quality control system in Brandguard to make sure that that works. So those are the things that we think about as we, talk to. Part of it is you always want to, when you're in my position, you're trying to sell somebody something, you're always trying to sell them on like, this is going to offload the work you don't like. So.
Yeah, the derivative, repetitive stuff. You could see with the smaller companies as well, how that could be quite an unlock to be able to organize around a particular local event or create their own event that it has a higher cadence than if they'd had to go down, if they'd had to sort of design everything from scratch. Is there a use case here for detecting IP theft or other parts of the sort of generative AI problem set?
There definitely is. There's a couple of pieces to it. One of the challenges with scouring the internet for examples of things is that you have to know where to look. And so we don't do that today. It may be something we do at some point. But what we have talked about is how could you figure out if the outputs of a machine learning model contain certain copyrighted material? And that's very challenging, but we have some ideas on how to do it. And the best way that I would explain these ideas is that you can fine tune a lot of these models, right? Which means you sort of retrain part of the nodes on some specific content specific to your brand or your topic or whatever. So think about it this way. I have a general model. I have ChatGPT, and then I have, 2 fine-tuned versions of ChatGPT plus my brand. And I ask all 3 of those questions, and I see if I trained it on, an extra 100 pieces of content and fine-tuned it versus 1,000 pieces of content, how much did it move from what originally ChatGPT said about my brand, and how clear was it and how detailed was it? And if you compare that across lots of things, because these models are statistical, then you should be able to understand if your fine-tuning is moving it a lot or not a lot. So if you prompt it with something where, so let me take an example. Let's say you took all references to the book Moby Dick out of the data set, right? There's no web pages about it. anywhere that it was, you deleted any pages that referred to it. And then you ask ChatGPT about the book Moby Dick, it wouldn't know anything, right? Because it's never seen anything about it. Whereas if you ask it a question and it spits something out that made a little bit of sense, you would know that like, okay, I didn't get all the Moby Dick content out, right? So now you can think about prompting it with something that should generate copyrighted content if it's in there, measuring the distance between its output and the real copyrighted content that you use to fine tune a model. So let's get a little like complicated maybe here theoretically, but you can see what I'm getting at, which is if you can measure the distance between one model that you create and the standard model, you might start to be able to figure out, we don't know, figure out that there's some copyrighted material in the model. So we are looking into some things like that. But on that point, one of the things we get asked to do a lot that we're also working on is to make sure that something that comes out of generative AI, not just is it high quality, not just is it on brand, but is it differentiated from competitors and not trademarked or copyrighted, right? The last thing you want to do is ask ChatGPT for a tagline and it spits something out and you're a, California tech company and you find out that the tagline is super close to a, Swedish appliance manufacturer that you didn't know existed. And now social media is going to mock you for having the software company that, looks like this other company. So we get asked to test for stuff like that. And we probably will do that soon.
That's awesome. Yeah. It's like writing copy for Reebok and having it come back saying, "Oh, just do it." That would be a bit of a challenge and a bit of a problem. I like the book example. We one of the stories that we'll show is that we've asked ChatGPT to write a review of our book, which came out in 2022. So after the training finished for ChatGPT, but it will spit out a really nice review. And it's kind of sort of there. But you could definitely, if there was some way to measure the delta between the description that's coming out versus an accurate description, you definitely find a wide, band there. But it will, it'll write a nice review. So I'm curious, you talk about multimodal. I see images, text. Is there a future and an interest in audio, video, like once those generation tools are interesting enough?
Yeah, we get audio a lot already because brands are thinking about voice interfaces.
Sure.
And, some types of brands like Flo from Progressive is a person who's, very tied to that brand. So you can imagine they want to use her voice in radio commercials and everything else. And so, I think there's a desire to make sure that a voice, the way that it sounds is on brand, the intonation's on brand as people move towards synthetic voices. We haven't done any of that yet. We have been asked about it. Video is really interesting because, video is sort of one way to think about it is a series of lots and lots of images. So the technical capabilities are there. It's very computationally intensive to do today. If you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have told you that generative video for brands was 2 years away. If you ask me today, I would say it's 4 to 6 months away. Like this stuff is happening faster than I thought. What's interesting is that it's not always like the last couple of 9 months of this have not been necessarily like huge shifts in new models and tools, but like tweaks on top of these things and an ecosystem evolving around foundation models that makes things makes a lot of tasks easier to do. So so I think video will be here, and I think it'll be really, really important. And you'll probably want to personalize that even more than you'd want to personalize like a Google text ad, or something because you can.
Yeah. You mentioned foundation models. Do you talk about what foundation models are underpinning your product?
Yeah, so we are agnostic to which models we use. So we support them all. So, we'll work with, Cohere, GPT-4, sometimes use GPT 3.5 as API as well. If you have any brands out there that are looking at that distinction, the engineering on the GPT-4 API is not as stable yet. And so the latency is worse. It goes down more. I'm sure OpenAI will fix it soon, but depending on whether you need GPT-4 quality, sometimes the 3.5 API is better. Same way with the image diffusion stuff. And we're talking to there are other companies, as you can imagine, that would have large image-based data sets that don't contain data from around the web, but still have hundreds of millions of images, and are sort of getting into that game. And we're talking to some of those companies. So part of our goal is to be built into the products that people are using sort of natively, partially for distribution on our side, but also because I really think we need to score people's generative content wherever it's being generated. And I just really believe that companies are going to, for most of the tools they use, they're going to get generative AI support in the next couple of years. So I think you'll have 30, 40, 50 SaaS apps that all have generative capabilities.
Sure.
I'm curious about when you're talking to customers, potential customers, what sort of education process you have to take them through, what parts of generative AI you find that are kind of overhyped and leading people astray versus where people's understanding is really tight and really well defined. How are you finding that sort of general theme of the market in that way?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think compared to previous technology waves that I've lived through, right? Web, mobile, cloud, social media, this is very different. Number one, because AI is it's really like a mix of technologies. Like, we're very focused on sort of like deep learning neural networks, but there's other ways to do it. And some companies use some of these other ways. And there's a lot of pieces of technology that sort of border around it. So that leads to a lot of confusion on its own. And then it's also weirdly like simultaneously overhyped and underhyped. Like, people are really worried when they saw ChatGPT that we're around the corner to creating killer robots, which I don't believe. But at the same time, there's a lot of technical people that are like, oh, it's just a statistical, analysis of whatever. It's actually pretty impressive, I think, what it can do for the time and the space that we're in. So I think it leads to a lot of confusion, not just amongst like non-technical people who have to grapple with how to use this, but even technical people. There's, I think, deep disagreements about where this is going over the next 12, 18 months. So the way that I try to approach it with the customers that we talk to, or really anybody who asks for my advice, is I think you have to look at this through the lens of uncertainty and exposure to certain outcomes. So I think you have to sit there and say, well, if you don't know where something is going, but you know it's going to be impactful, what do you want to do? You want to find ways to place small bets that if they move your way, can be really, really valuable. So I think, like, if there's a company that, I remember, like, 20 years ago, big companies were going to wait when new technology came out. They were going to wait till it was stable. They were going to wait and be late adopters. And that was intentionally their philosophy, because they didn't want it to be buggy and they didn't want it to be unsupported because it was a startup that went away. And now that has shifted, where you kind of have to ride the wave, because these things give you so much more advantages than moving from, Windows 2000 to, Vista or whatever it would do. And so I think, companies that aren't experimenting with this at all because they're waiting to see, I think they're going to fall dramatically behind. But I agree that it's probably, unless you have a clear line of sight to an outcome, it can be an area that's hard to go make a big bet, both culturally and financially in a company. So I think making small bets and learning and figuring things out so that you have the possibility to be exposed to these really good outcomes when the time is right and when you have the right organizational understanding is the way that I encourage people to approach it.
You talked about a couple of different foundation model companies or open source projects. I'm curious if you're hearing anything from your customers about the sort of couple different strategies that are happening here. One is models that are trained on everything that's available on the internet versus models that are being quite careful about what IP they're hoovering up. And then also the question of closed versus open source. And do you hear anything back from your customers about those two different strategies in the foundation models?
Yeah, well, people love Adobe since they came out and guaranteed that they would take this copyright risk for image generation off the table. So I think with their Firefly tool, so I think people are pretty excited about that. It's one thing that I've heard. Yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion because the legal standing around AI created products is not well defined. And you could make a really good argument for kind of either way that it could go, that, like it's hard for me as a non-legal person to determine, like, all this is probably going to go to the Supreme Court at some point, and the Supreme Court's either going to say, well, yes, 1/10 millionth of your image was contributed by Rob May, and so he gets a half a penny every time you use that. Or they could say, well, it was public domain internet, and if a human had looked at it and then used it to create something, and it was far enough away, you wouldn't have to pay anything for it. So just the fact that the machine looked at it and trained on it is nothing. So we really don't have a good paradigm for it. And so I think people are very confused. And as you know, like, big companies are very worried about the risk, because the last thing that you want to do is engage in a project where you're like, well, our legal liability outweighs the benefits of the project. So I think it's why you've seen this wave of startups come that, not just like us that provide a layer over some of this stuff, but I think it's why you're seeing some of the companies that don't have to scrape the web get into the game, because I think your big brands are really, really interested in that. On the open source side, I think it's also just as confusing. I think people are using more open source to experiment and see if they should build internal capabilities around this stuff. But it's also hard because it's moving so fast. You don't want to build capabilities that are then outdated in 9 months. And here's a thought experiment that I propose a lot of times to some of these brands, which is, if you've used GPT-4 to generate any kind of software code, it's pretty good. It's much better than GPT-3. So it's interesting. And there are people building more advanced versions on top of that. So sometimes I think about this, right? Let's assume hypothetically that the cost to write code over the next 5 years drops by 70, 80, maybe 90%. What does that mean as a business for your build versus buy decisions? I mean, we buy a lot of software because we're like, well, it's not our, we're not going to write a CRM. As much as we don't like Salesforce or whatever we're using, it's not worth our time to go write one. But if you could write one in 10 days, might you do it and get exactly what you want? You'd have to still think through, like, what does it cost to maintain it and everything else. But it's definitely going to shift all those build versus buy decisions that are on the margins for companies, which could have really negative impacts on SaaS companies and everything else. So, like, it's a fascinating time to be working in software, because for the first time in my career, it's not just like, does the software work and what are you building and what are the features? It's like there's legal and all kinds of weird stuff surrounding it, right? That you have to think through. So it's kind of fun.
On that note, in addition to being an entrepreneur, you're a very active investor. Are there any investments that you made that you want to give a shout out to in terms of things that you think are really interesting right now?
Well, something that's really interesting that's related to what we just talked about. I'm an investor in a company called TermScout, TermScout, and they analyze contracts and they highlight things that are off market. So if you've ever sold software, you get into this, you're selling to a big company and they come back and they want changes to your standard indemnification clause. And you can't really prove to them that, like, no, what you're asking for is out of market. And they're like, no, it's standard. Everybody does it for us. So what TermScout does is they've reviewed, millions of contracts, and they can tell you what's in market and what's not for all these clauses. And they can highlight it. So they actually have a partnership with IBM, where all of IBM's online contracts now that you click through to sign up for things are TermScout approved. So it calls out certain features and things you might want to pay attention to about, data privacy and everything else. So I think that's really cool. But the area that I'm most excited about, that the wave that I see building and coming that hasn't come yet, is AI hardware. So one of the challenges with GPUs is, if bigger models perform better, if you double the size of a model, it takes more than twice as long to train it typically. So that's still a nonlinear function. And we need to fix that if bigger models are going to be the path. And there's a whole bunch of AI hardware companies that are coming with alternatives to GPUs. Untethered.ai, Rain Neuromorphics, which is a neuromorphic chip I'm invested in. Mythic is an analog crossbar array chip. And so when these things come out, they're going to be able to train, both for training and inference, they're going to make these AI workloads maybe 50, 100 times more efficient. So when that propagates in a couple of years through the system and all this, you can imagine, running a large language model on a tiny microcontroller size chip for $2, like, is going to be amazing. If we get there, what impacts does that have for the world? And so the mental model that I use for these things normally is, when the price of these things drop dramatically, where is the new bottleneck? What becomes more valuable? What becomes harder to do? So yeah, I think there's going to be some really cool technology coming.
Kind of a new AI Moore's law.
Yeah, I guess so.
I know you.
Yeah.
It's going to turn your mind to, okay, so what's Apple doing?
Yep, I do have a constant refrain, which is just, I can't get out of it, having been at Apple many years ago. But I'm always sort of looking at this sort of question of as we think about the large models, the foundation models, closed source, open source, there's always this sort of refrain of, well, Apple isn't doing anything as far as we know. But I actually think that one of the most interesting thing is what they've done at the chip level. And whenever they accelerate something for their M chip, like if they accelerate Stable Diffusion to be able to run natively on that chip, that has a potentially huge impact. And so I agree with you. Like these chips, when they can actually accelerate something, in a really efficient way, it can have a dramatic, impact upstream, downstream, depending on how you think about it. In terms of what else in the ecosystem actually really works.
Yeah, I think I'll tell you, I don't have an iPhone, I do have a MacBook, and since they've launched these new AI chips, right? The last maybe 2 generations of MacBooks, I think it is, the battery life plus performance is phenomenal, and it's really impressive, and Apple doesn't get enough play in the AI ecosystem because they don't publish a lot of research and they're not a very open company about what they're doing. But they've made some really smart moves related to AI. And I think they understand their competitive advantages and their assets that they have. And I think they're very well positioned to take advantage of what's coming. There's no need for them to produce a large language model until such time as they can just put it on an iPhone. Right? And you can, use the ChatGPT equivalent in Siri for 2 cents. And but they're known for data privacy, which is important. They're very integrated from up and down the stack, hardware, firmware, software, and I think that's going to be very important. They really think a lot about user interfaces, which I think is really important in this world and they have a lot of experience with Siri and these new voice interfaces. I'm sure they're thinking about chat interfaces, and I think they'll be a company that's very thoughtful about how user interaction patterns are changing in this world. And so I think, I'd be long Apple in an AI world, even though I know they're not typically mentioned in the conversations about sort of pure raw AI research, but I'm sure they've got some pretty good stuff going on there, even at the research level.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. How can people follow you and keep track of what you're doing?
Yeah, you can check us out at Brandguard.ai if you want to check out the product. And if you're interested in following my writing, I write a newsletter called Investing in AI. And that's at investinginai.substack.com. I write about 2 or 3 times a month. And you can always follow me on Twitter. I'm just at Rob May. I don't tweet a lot, but when I do, it's mostly work related. But it's a good place to see everything.
Excellent. Well, I do enjoy your writing. We get your newsletter, so thanks for that. And I do especially like the sort of speculative nature. You kind of put things out there and sort of see what people might react, and I think that's nice. You sort of open it up for people to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, cool. The worst you can do is be wrong, right? Which is in the business I'm in, startups, you have to have beginner's mind all the time, right? Constantly rethinking, what's going to happen. So
yeah, awesome. We have to celebrate the people who are prepared to make predictions.
Yes, because all predictions are wrong. Some are useful. Yeah. There you go. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
Stay